My father never spoke much about his time in the war, and never about the U-110 encounter. I received from the Royal Navy Command his service history record, serving as a petty officer in the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. I would like to start by showing an archive film. It explains very clearly why Atlantic convoys were so important in World War II to both the British and the Germans. And then after the film, sharing with you official documentation about the convoy OB318, destroyer attack diagrams and interview statements from crew of the captured U-110.
2 years into hostilities with the Germans, the British position in the Battle of the Atlantic seemed hopeless. The Germans were destroying up to 800,000 tons of shipping per month, sinking ships faster than the British and Americans could build them. Britain's lifeline was in grave danger of being choked off. Her leaders were secretly worried that defeat was at hand. Winston Churchill himself had dark fears that the mighty German Navy would sound the death knell for Great Britain.
Churchill believed that the Battle of the Atlantic was one of the most important parts of Britain's efforts in World War II. He said he was frightened sometime by the number of sinkings and wondered how long Britain could continue into the war.
The Atlantic is home to countless fierce predators, but perhaps none were as ferocious as Germany's dreaded fleet of U-boats. These sleek steel death machines of the open ocean were known as Grey Wolves. Dönitz controlled everything from his lavish headquarters in occupied France, issuing a steady stream of instructions and orders to his trusted warriors beneath the waves. For the reign of the Grey Wolves depended on constant communication with Dönitz.
All orders bringing the U-boats together were issued from his headquarters by radio communications. The U-boats constantly reported back their positions, their usages of torpedoes, their fuel, and so forth. And of course, this created a lot of communications material for the British to lock in on if they managed to break it.
But Dönitz was convinced the Allies could never break his codes because he had a secret weapon, the Enigma machine. Almost all wartime communication on both the Allied and Axis sides was encrypted, but the Enigma was among the most sophisticated of all encryption machines. It was capable of millions of variations and considered unbreakable by the German High Command. Using messages kept secret by Enigma, Dönitz could dispatch U-boats to surround British convoys. The British had their top codebreakers working around the clock at an English country estate called Bletchley Park to plumb its secrets. If they didn't solve the riddle of the Enigma, they knew the war might be lost.
Churchill looked at a chart at the Admiralty, watching the line of sinkings rising on the wall to a red line which they had drawn across the top, which meant that Britain could not continue the war, and it was rapidly approaching that line.
As the curtain closed on 1940, Britain's fate rose and fell in the most capricious and uncertain of places, the rolling waters of the open ocean. The men of Germany's U-boat fleet roamed the high seas unhindered during the early days of World War II. Their stealth made them a frustratingly elusive target for enemy ships. The U-boats were deadly instruments of power and brought both misery and glory to those who served aboard them. Georg Hogel joined the German Navy in 1937 at the age of 18 and became a U-boat radio operator the following year. He was one of the select young men in Dönitz U-boat service.
Die Begeisterung für die U-Boot-Waffe, wie gesagt, das war natürlich...
The enthusiasm for the U-boats, so to speak, came from a young man's desire to be in a service to which we attributed danger and a certain prestige. We wanted to become men, and therefore we wanted to join a service which was considered to be one of the toughest.
The unprecedented success of the U-boat crews made them heroes at home. Nazi Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels lionized the most noted U-boat aces and dubbed them the Grey Wolves. Adolf Hitler himself handed out iron crosses to the most decorated of U-boat skippers.
When
we returned home, there was an orchestra at the pier. There were officers, other crews, and maybe even a few young ladies. As sailors on a U-boat, we were maybe aware that we were using one of the most dangerous weapons and that our fight in the Atlantic was necessary to cut the English trade.
With their white-peaked caps and astonishing tales of seafaring victories and derring-do, these elite young officers and their men were given the privileges of royalty. The best of everything was theirs for the taking.
They were issued the highest medals, they got the best pay, they got the best food. There were films made about them, they were treated as heroes.
We had excellent food, and you might laugh about this. But we always had porcelain on board. The only time we had to eat from a tin plate was when we returned home, and there was no more unbroken porcelain available.
Dönitz's emphasis on making heroes of the U-boat aces may have been in part an ingenious strategy to offset the reality of the most arduous and deadly job in the German military.
The U-boat was almost unlivable by the standards of civilians. It was crowded, it was dirty. There was one head for all 47 men, officers and men. It was almost always in use. You couldn't use it when the boat was submerged.
It took a seaman with a singular dedication and audacity to withstand such grueling conditions, and to descend time and again in the iron coffins, from which 2 out of every 3 sailors never returned.
I was always aware of the fact that this boat could be my coffin. I often told some of my comrades in critical situations that it doesn't make any sense to run from one end of the boat to the other. If a torpedo explodes, you will drown anyway. Death comes so fast, I used to say, that you probably won't feel much. Each voyage was different, and each event showed us that we actually did not know anything, and that there were 100 more ways to lose one's life.
One of the courageous stars of Dönitz's U-boat fleet was 28-year-old Fritz Julius Lemp. Lemp had joined the Navy at the age of 18, and in 10 years' time had become the youngest captain in the history of German submarine warfare. Lemp was cautious but aggressive and unflappable in battle. He was known sometimes to give orders just so his men could hear the calm, confident sound of his voice. Georg Hogel served under Lemp on his first mission on the Type 7 sub U-30.
He was a very friendly captain. He backed up his men as much as he could, even if they made a blunder. As a radio operator, I was constantly next to him. We were separated only by a little hallway and developed a personal relationship. With his permission, during the times when there was nothing going on, which happened frequently, we could play records for the crew. These were little things, but they made life a little more comfortable and contributed to the camaraderie. Nothing could have worked without that.
Lemp had assured his place in history in the opening days of the war between Germany and Britain while skippering the U-30. Waiting for fighting to begin on September the 3rd, 1939, Dönitz had issued strict orders to his U-boat fleet. They were not to attack passenger ships in observance of the regulations passed by the Hague Convention at the turn of the century.
Enemy convoys to be attacked without warning only on conditions that all passenger liners carrying passengers are allowed to proceed in safety. These vessels are immune from attack, even in convoy.
Lurking beneath the waters of the Atlantic at the helm of the U-30, Lemp peered through his periscope and glimpsed a large ship zigzagging in the water. Immediately assuming she was an armed merchant cruiser, Lemp ordered his men to fire torpedoes. torpedoes struck the hapless ship's port flank dead on.
And he sank the ship. And he came to surface to inspect his handiwork, and he saw that she was not an armed merchant cruiser.
Lemp, overzealous and eager to make his mark in the highly competitive Kriegsmarine, had made a terrible blunder. The ship he sank was the British luxury liner Athenia, en route from Glasgow to New York with more than 1,300 people aboard. 100 innocents died that day. 28 of the victims were Americans. But Lemp survived this early mistake and was later awarded an Iron Cross by Dönitz, who seemed to have a soft spot for him. By 1941, he was a decorated lieutenant at the helm of the U-110, a new swift and powerful Type 9 attack boat, one of the jewels of the Nazi arsenal. To staff his gleaming new vessel, Lemp requested his best men from the U-30 crew, Georg Hogel among them.
There was nothing more inconvenient for a U-boat crew member than to be separated from his crew. This is why Captain Lemp wanted to keep people on board who had already served under him and had experience.
On May the 9th, 1941, Lemp and the crew of the U-110 were stalking the icy waters off the coast of Greenland when they sighted a mammoth British convoy. Here was another opportunity for Lemp to enhance his reputation and deal another blow to the British Empire. It was just another day at war, just another convoy. Lemp couldn't have known that on that sunny day in 1941, he was about to become a pivotal player in one of the Atlantic's most titanic struggles. Meanwhile, aboard British convoy OB-318, this routine journey to America to gather raw materials for the war effort seemed to be proceeding smoothly. Even officers like Sub-Lieutenant David Barnes, stationed on the escort destroyer HMS Bulldog, had no sense of the danger that lay ahead.
It was a fine day. I think there was some quite sunny blue skies, big swell as you always get in the Atlantic. It was about noon. I was standing on the bridge.
Bulldog was just one of the 38 ships in the convoy procession, plodding through the waves at a deliberate pace.
Some of these ships are very old, and they'd only go at about 8 knots. So the speed of this convoy would be about 8 knots, incredibly so.
To the wolves waiting beneath the waves, these lumbering vessels appeared easy prey indeed. Through his periscope, Fritz Julius Lemp sighted his quarry and decided to attack.
Torpedo! Fire! Fire!
Two British merchant ships exploded and disappeared beneath the waves.
Terrific explosion, of course, 2 of our merchant ships being hit. And they sink very quickly, these merchant ships, matter of minutes.
David Barnes' commanding officer, A.J. Baker Cresswell, heard the explosions from his position on the Bulldog's bridge.
We dashed over to a direction we thought the submarine must be and attacked with depth charges.
The depth charges launched by the British were set at the perfect range, and the U-110's escape was cut off. Mortally wounded, she staggered deeper into the black depths of the freezing Atlantic.
The explosion was so strong that we thought it was over. You were in a cage for which there was no escape.
Lemp was faced with a terrible decision. If he let the boat sink, he and his crew of 45 men would surely die as the implacable ocean's pressure crushed the submarine. If they surfaced, the British would likely kill them and capture the boat. And the U-110, like all German U-boats, carried an Enigma machine, the centerpiece of Dönitz's strategy to win the Battle of the Atlantic. To surrender the Enigma and the Nazis' secret codes would be to give the Allies a key weapon they needed to turn the tide against Hitler. The Depth charges continued to explode around the U-110, adding to the confusion and panic. The stricken boat sunk further. Lemp, torn between the sense of duty and honor drilled into him by Dönitz and the instinct for survival, agonized while his men waited silently for his orders. He had only a few more seconds to make a decision that would perhaps alter the course of World War II. May the 9th, 1941 had dawned uncharacteristically bright and clear in the chilly North Atlantic. But the day had turned dark for German U-boat captain Fritz Julius Lemp and his men aboard the U-110. They had just sunk 2 merchant ships in a convoy returning from Great Britain, but depth charges had mortally wounded their submarine. Lemp had spent nearly half his life at sea. He'd matched wits with the best the ocean had to offer and been victorious each time. But he'd never faced certain death as surely as he did that afternoon, as his U-boat hung lifelessly in the Atlantic. The ocean's pressure squeezed the boat's hull, causing floor plates that normally sat flush to buckle and overlap. Lemp realized that if he didn't surface, he and all of his men would perish beneath the waves. Lemp gathered himself, and in the calm voice his crew had come to expect, no matter how exultant or grave the situation, gave the order to surface. He was giving up instead of going down. He blew the ballast tanks, and the U-110 rocketed up from the depths of the Atlantic.
And the only time they realize that they've hit the surface is when they feel the swell of the ocean banging against the sides of the submarine.
Lemp gave orders for scuttling charges to be set, then told his men to abandon ship. The British sailors aboard the Bulldog watched in disbelief as the U-110 broke the surface near their destroyer. Baker Creswell, David Baum, and the rest of the Bulldog crew were face to face with their formerly invisible nemesis. Baker Creswell prepared to drive the prow of his ship through the monstrous Nazi war machine.
Lemp went to check out the situation. The first thing he said was, "Ships, ships, ships!" My station chief asked him about the classified material, and he told us to leave everything on the boat. The only thing he said was, get out, we are being rammed."
But as the British commander watched the crew of the U-110 leaping into the water, he realized he had a rare chance to seize a German sub. Sub-Lieutenant David Baum was charged with leading the boarding party. Time was of the essence, since the British assumed the evacuating Germans had activated scuttling charges to sink their own vessel. A tiny rowboat dropped over the side of the Bulldog, and Baum and 8 men cautiously made their way towards the Grey Wolf. They knew it was possible the submarine could blow up beneath them at any second. Baum and his crew were facing a peril they'd never encountered before.
We took our rowing boat alongside the house, jumped on board. I had my revolver in my hand.
As David Baum climbed aboard the U-110, the members of her crew struggled to stay afloat in the swells of the Atlantic. They had completely abandoned the surfaced submarine. Some of the crew had been killed in crossfire from the British destroyers, others drowned in the sea. 32 others were snatched from the water and hustled below decks on the British ships.
I was among the last 8 people who left the boat. I jumped from the bridge onto the deck. Since the stern was already underwater, I ran to the tower, to the front of the boat. When I reached the cannon, a large wave swept over the boat. I first held on and then let go.
But what of the U-110's fearless commander, Fritz Julius Lemp? Some witnesses claim that when he saw that the scuttling charges hadn't fired, he swam back towards his submarine, determined to sink it himself before it fell into enemy hands. The truth is still unknown, whether he drowned in the attempt or was shot down by British gunfire.
Captain Lemp
was on the tower and helped everybody to get out of the boat. I was swimming in another direction. I couldn't see what happened to him. The only thing I know is that we never saw him again.
And as the gentle swells of the Atlantic washed over her, a different officer now strode the deck of the U-110.
And I then walked along the deck of the U-boat, which is a pretty slippery thing, with water breaking over it. But then I came to a ladder going up to the conning tower, and I had to holster my revolver, use both hands to go up a vertical ladder.
Baum made his way down the U-110's conning tower as his men waited anxiously on the deck. He still didn't know what dangers awaited him below.
I opened up the hatch, going down below, and this was the worst moment of the whole day. In fact, I might say the worst moment of my life. Opening up that hatch, seeing nobody down below, but then thinking there must be somebody down below.
Baum descended into the captured U-110. He couldn't have been more vulnerable to a waiting enemy intent upon revenge or ambush.
I had to holster my revolver and go down this vertical ladder of about 15 feet, wondering if there was somebody down below who would have certainly shot me if I'd arrived.
But there was no armed enemy sailor awaiting Baum in the cabin of the U-110. The boat was desolate.
I arrived down at the bottom, in the control room of this U-boat. The secondary lighting was on, dim lighting, and there was that deathly silence. Just the plopping of the waves against our hull, but nobody there. I quickly went from one end of the U-boat to the other, and still nobody there. So I then called down my boarding party to come and join me.
Still in a race against the expected explosion of German scuttling charges, Baum and his men canvassed their captured trophy from bow to stern.
We obviously wanted to find all the code books and charts and everything like that. We're only 8 of us, but we made a chain. We sent up every book, except for obviously reading books. I had a telegraphist in my boarding party. His job is immediately to go to the wireless office and take the settings and all the sets. And he came along to me and said, "Would you like to come and see something in the wireless office?" We didn't know what it was. It just looked like a typewriter.
Baum and his crewmen tried the keys on this typewriter, and something strange happened.
If you punched in, say, for example, the letter A, it may come out as a Z. However, next time you punch the letter A, it may come out as an N or something else.
Baum and his crew had discovered the German secret weapon, a key to the success of their underwater war strategy. It was the Enigma machine itself, the encryption device that kept the secrets of the U-boats from the Allies. In their race to save themselves, the German crew had left behind not only the device itself, but the codebooks, rotor settings, and a grid map marking the sectors for all of Germany's U-boats in the Atlantic. They had surrendered a virtual handbook of their secret communications system to the British. It was a remarkable capture. Baum ordered the Enigma machine removed and sent topside, unaware that he had just made one of the most important intelligence seizures of the war.
And I said, yes, it looks interesting. We both thought it was. So I said, unscrew it and send it up. And he had a very bright chap. He had a screwdriver with him, so he just unscrewed it from a wooden table, 4 screws, and up it went. Fortunately, it wasn't dropped overboard.
6 hours had passed since Baum had boarded the U-110. The convoy had long since moved on, and now the Bulldog was called away by a submarine alert. Satisfied that no scuttling charges had been set, Baum and his men were left alone aboard the enemy submarine, bobbing precariously in the middle of the endless Atlantic.
And that was a very nasty moment. I was there with my boarding party of about 8 of us, standing up on deck, nothing in sight at all. Grey skies, mist, wind getting up, and nothing in sight. One only prayed that the Bulldog would find us again in the middle of the Atlantic.
The Bulldog returned a few hours later and placed the once mighty U-110 under tow. The course was set for a British naval base in Iceland, but the Atlantic, unpredictable to the end, rose to reclaim the boat that had once prowled her cold, dark depths.
The gale got up, and then at 11 o'clock on the 10th, the day after, she suddenly went down, her bows came right up. She went down, went and slipped the tail, and she sank.
And so, with all of her precious secrets captured by the British and her imprisoned crew completely unaware of the loss, the U-110's grey frame slipped beneath the waters of the Atlantic for the last time. Soon after seizing the German submarine U-110 in the North Atlantic in the spring of 1941, British naval officer David Baum realized that the capture was important. But he didn't know how important until more than a week after the dramatic battle at sea.
We eventually fetched up in Scapa Flow, the big naval base in Scotland. The Admiralty sent up an intelligence officer, their top intelligence officer, and he told me as soon as he saw it, he said, "This is amazing, we've never had anything like this. We've been looking for this for a whole war."
Enigma had been solved, the code machine and settings found. Combined with documents seized from 2 German weather ships off Greenland, the British now had detailed information on Wolfpack formations, weather reports and convoy sightings. And with code books that gave rotor settings until the end of June, the cryptographers at Bletchley Park finally had the tools to crack the seemingly unbreakable Enigma. The fortunes of war had shifted, this time in favor of the British. And knowing that for perhaps the first time in the Battle of the Atlantic the advantage was suddenly theirs, the British took drastic steps to ensure that their dramatic capture would remain secret. They reported the U-110 lost at sea with all hands aboard. The German sailors were secretly shuttled to prisoner of war camps in North America.
We boarded a ship in Liverpool, which traveled to Canada and landed on January 1st, 1942 in Halifax. We spent 3 days on the train, after which we reached the prison camp 23. This camp was somewhere south of the Hudson Bay.
With Hogle and the rest of the U-110's crew at the prisoner of war camp in Canada, somehow the seizing of the Enigma machine was kept under wraps.
And what's really interesting is that they were able to keep it such a secret for so long. All the sailors involved in the incident kept quiet about it, and this is really an amazing feat.
Wonderful people, the sailors, they all told the absolute dead secret. And nobody ever breathed a word. And nobody ever knew that we'd boarded U-110.
Armed with the information from the Enigma capture, the British diverted many of their convoys out of harm's way and began to wrest control of the Atlantic back from the Germans. The British were immediately able to change the course of their ships and ultimately the course of the war. Dönitz and the rest of the Nazi high command couldn't understand why convoys weren't showing up where they were supposed to be, and why their vaunted U-boats were suddenly being sunk by British destroyers marauding the high seas in hunter-killer groups.
It cannot depend on chance. It is possible that from some source or other, their information might be gained, A, as a result of treachery, B, by decrypting our radio messages, which is out of the question.
This is the official document, the U-boat attacks on OB318, Phase 2, 9th of May 1941, and there were 38 ships in the convoy in rows of 9. The escort ship formation were 5 ships in front, and 1 each side, and 1 at the rear. So let's just have a look at the ships and what they were. So looking at the diagram, looking from the front, right to left, we have HMS Amazon, which was a destroyer, H39. Next to that, the Hollyhock, it was a corvette, K64. Next to that, HMS Bulldog, H91 destroyer. Nigella, a corvette, K19. And then the Broadway, H90, which is a destroyer. The left flank is covered by HMT Daneman. Now HMT stands for His Majesty's Trawler, which I didn't know. It was commissioned, or they were commissioned by the Royal Navy and modified with a forward turret. Some had depth charges, some had Aztec. There was a multi-range of duties they did and did them very well. To the right of the flank there you can see HMS Alberta. That was another corvette, K-96. And at the rear of the convoy you can see ST Apollo, which is another HMT. So 2 ships were hit then by U-110 and sunk. SS Edmund, with a crew of 50, was torpedoed and sunk. All 50 were rescued on SS Edmund. And SS Bangor Head, with a crew of 41, 40 of whom were rescued. Alberta, Broadway and Bulldog changed course to intercept the U-boat. The map is also marked with Operation Primrose, and this is the location of the surfaced U-110. The code name given for that recovery of the Enigma machine was Operation Primrose. Official report from Captain Baker Creswell. At 12:02 GMT on the 9th of May 1941, 2 ships of convoy OB-318, which being escorted by the 3rd Escort Group, were torpedoed in position 60 20 minutes north, 33 40 minutes west. Escorts were dispersed, as found in the diagram attached. It was evident to me that the attack had come from a position between the Broadway and the Alberta. Both ships were almost completely and immediately attacked. Broadway at 12:08, Alberta shortly afterwards. Bulldog was also in contact and could see that Alberta's attack was a good one. Bulldog had moved over to join the hunt. At 12:35, a conning tower was sighted at about 800 yards range off the port beam. Fire was immediately opened by a 4.7-inch 2-pounder tom-toms and a stripped Lewis gun. 1 shell struck the conning tower and the men were seen to be abandoning the submarine. Fire was ceased by the heavier guns, but the men were speeded on their way by small arms fire. HMS Broadway was then seen to be about to ram. The submarine turned her stern onto her and the Broadway grazed the submarine, and in doing so had a port forward fuel tank hold. She dropped depth charges close to the submarine's bow. Oil covered the water. HMS Bulldog stopped within 100 yards of the submarine and sent away an armed whaler crew. No sign of a white flag was seen, and 2 men appeared to be manning the submarine's forward gun. Fire was again opened by a Lewis gun, and 2 of the 3 men were hit. My object was to keep the crew rattled. They already appeared dazed and uncertain what to do. By the time the whaler was alongside the submarine, the whole crew appeared to have jumped into the water. There was a moderate sea running, and the waves were breaking over the U-boat's deck. The officer in charge of the whaler, appreciating the necessity of speed, ran his boat hard onto the submarine, and a wave carried it onto the deck, where it was smashed. The crew found that the conning tower hatch was closed. They opened it and went below without delay. Their orders were to seize all books and anything that looked important. Shortly after, they signalled the U-boat had been abandoned and appeared to be sound and no danger of sinking. I therefore decided to take her in tow and passed a 3.5-inch wire. The submarine was trimmed slightly by the stern and had a slight list to port. She was making a little headway downwind. Meanwhile, another submarine had torpedoes from 2 more ships of the convoy and was being counterattacked by HMS Amazon and 2 other corvettes and trawlers of the 3rd group. HMS Broadway and HMS Alberta had obtained a further contact and were dropping depth charges. They eventually reported having lost contact. Alberta reported that it had been doubtful. I therefore ordered Broadway to close and lower a boat. Broadway's boat made 2 journeys to bring back books, charts and documents. The wind and sea were rising all the time and the visibility had shut down to 4 miles. The convoy had turned away from the U-boat after the first attack and was soon out of sight. Consequently, no ship in the convoy witnessed the capture of the submarine. From the amount of gunfire they must have heard, it may be supposed that they imagined the submarine had been sunk. Everyone was back on board by 1830, and speed increased to 6 knots, and the U-boat, although she had settled slightly more aft, seemed perfectly seaworthy. I had ordered Broadway to escort me, carrying out a broad zigzag astern, and had Alberta rejoin the convoy. Bulldog set a course of 045. There was no incident that night, and the submarine seemed quite comfortable at the speed of the tow. The wind had risen slightly and was southwesterly, force 4 at 0400. By 0700 it had veered west by south. The increased force 6 with the nasty lumpy sea, it was now possible to hold the course. It was decided to let the submarine head downwind, as she seemed comfortable in that position, and keep the wire just taut. Suddenly at 11 o'clock the U-boat began to sink by the stern. Shortly her bow was standing vertically out of the water. She slowly sank and the wire was cut. The prize must have been working slightly in the heavy sea. This may have aggravated any damage caused by the depth charging or contact with the Broadway. Her loss was a bitter blow, as it was felt that having survived so many shocks, particularly Broadway's depth charges close to her bow, she should be able to stand the 400-mile tow to Iceland. I consider that she was forced to service in the first place by Alberta's well-executed attack. Great credit is therefore due to her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander V.F. Smith, RNR, for contributing directly towards the destruction of U-110. Commander, HMS Bulldog. Remarks on the crew of U-110. The complement of U-110 consisted of 4 officers, 15 petty officers, 27 ratings totaling 46. A war correspondent with the rank of a temporary sub-lieutenant was also carried. When the U-boat was sunk, the captain, 3 petty officers and 11 ratings lost their lives. 4 officers and 28 men were rescued. The war correspondent, Lieutenant Siegfried Sulfurer, temporary sub-lieutenant Helmuth Eick, is mentioned in great detail later in this report under the heading Propaganda Compare. Although he had never been in a U-boat before, Eric professed not to like too much the confined conditions on board, as he did not want to be regarded purely as a passenger. He took turn on watch as conning tower lookout. He said that he took between 200 and 300 photographs of life aboard the U-boat. While I, like all other survivors, repeatedly expressed their gratitude for the very generous treatment accorded to them by the British destroyer, he was furious, indignant at being taken to Brixton prison on arrival in London. He bitterly resented being clothed in prison garments. He remained so bitterly resentful, however, at this example of the way in which the English treat their prisoners of war, that he intends featuring the incident in a book which he hopes to write for a publication after the war. The petty officers were nearly all men of considerable experience who had served under Lemp on most of the cruises of U-30. He seemed to have been unusually successful retaining his experienced men. Many of the ratings had been drafted without option and were very raw and ill-trained, and some were on their first cruise when U-110 was sunk. They did not stand up to an emergency and become panic-stricken in the first sign of action. One man had undergone an operation for a rupture some 6 weeks before the last cruise, but was nevertheless obliged to take his place on board. An even more astonishing fact was the inclusion of a man who had been in a concentration camp and had suffered appalling cruelty at the hands of the Nazis. This man was entrusted with the important and responsible duties, although he must have been classed by the German naval authorities as reliable. Prisoners state, in spite of bad weather, U-110 closed the convoy during the night of the 8th and 9th of May, was prevented from servicing in the bright moonlight by the strong destroyer escort, and did not dare attack, even from periscope depth. She therefore maintained contact with the convoy during the morning of the 9th of May. Prisoners did not know whether the convoy was the same one which had been reported as forming up in the Hebrides some days earlier, but they thought that it most probably was the same. During the forenoon of the 9th of May 1941, U-110 was stated to have been joined by U-201, Oberleutnant Zur C. Schnee, and the captain confirmed as to their course of action before proceeding independently. Schnee considered that the attack on the convoy should not be postponed longer than necessary, and it was agreed that U-110 should attack first and that U-201 should attack half an hour later. Eric, the war correspondent, said he shot a film on a miniature camera of the meetings of the two U-boat commanders and of the second U-boat proceeding away and submerging. The film, together with the photographs and cameras, he believed went down with the U-boat. He said that the films would have been an excellent feature for the British news cameras. We now know, of course, when the U-110 was boarded, the mini camera was recovered from that U-boat. So it'd be very interesting to see what happened to that film. Although Lemp would have preferred to wait until nightfall, it was realised that U-110 was already very far to the west, in fact further west than any, in the opinion of prisoners, a U-boat has ever attack has been made. U-110 was said to have 3 electric and 1 air torpedo in her bow tubes at this juncture, and replaced the air torpedoes by a 4th electric torpedo. Prisoners stated that U-110 dived at 12:37 German time, and at 12:39 fired 3 electric torpedoes with an interval of 30 seconds. Germans believed that the 3 ships of 5,000 tons, 7,000 tons were sunk. They claimed to have heard 3 explosions. The order was given to fire a 4th bow torpedo with the object of sinking a ship believed to have been a whale factory of 15,000 tons. The order was passed on by the engineer officer when the tube was flooded, but for some reason there was a misfire which resulted in an argument between the first lieutenant and the engineering officer. U-110 carried out her attack from periscope depth and, according to prisoners, did not dive immediately but waited to observe the results. The quartermaster stated that the attacking destroyer passed immediately over the crash-diving U-110 at 12:23 GMT, then dropped a pattern of depth charges which caused great damage inside the U-boat. He said that the damage of the depth gauge was smashed and that the spare depth gauge, operated by oil pressure, in the after department showed a depth of 84 metres, that's 275.6 feet, soon after the first depth charge exploded. But the instrument was described as unreliable, and this statement should not be accepted. Conflicting statements were made as the total number of depth charge attacks, but most prisoners stated that 3 patterns were dropped and that 18 explosions were heard. The Germans believed that the British now had a new and accurate system of dropping depth charges. The last pattern was described as having been particularly well aimed. The effect of these attacks was to wreck completely the interior of U-110. The hydroplanes were put out of action at an early stage, as was the rudder soon afterwards. The rudder indicator was smashed, also the compasses. Oil from the damaged fuel tank penetrated into the U-boat near the galley. There was a certain degree of panic among the crew, most of whom rushed forward as the U-boat went down somewhat by the stern. Some men complained of having experienced difficulty in breathing. The U-boat's depth was now shown by an inaccurate spare manometer to have been 95 metres 311 feet. The captain hoped to escape on the electric motors, but these had been put out of action. 1 battery had been damaged and gas was produced. Realizing the impossibility of escape, he ordered the tanks to be blown with the intention of surfacing, but the wheel-like control of the blowing system was found to be broken and lying on the floor plates. The German considered that the depth charge must have exploded very close to U-110 to have done so much damage. They added the explosions were above them. For a few moments consideration ran along the crew, but the unexpected rocking movement told them that U-boat had come to the surface in some unexplained way. One suggestion was that the suction of the water upwards resulting in the explosion of the depth charges may have drawn the U-boat upwards. A chief mechanic thought the explosion of the depth charges, which had smashed the control and the blowing system at the time, turned on the air supply, which had then automatically blown the tanks. The conning tower hatch was open, and quickly all the hands were ordered to abandon ship as quickly as possible. The captain stood on the bridge and hustled his men overboard. He was subsequently seen swimming in the sea and inquired of the first lieutenant and the engineering officer of how the junior officer was, as he knew they had only recently recovered from a long illness. Prisoners thought that the external fuel tank must have been damaged, as there was a large quantity of oil in the sea. They added that the British opened fire on the U-boat and that some men were killed and others injured while abandoning ship. The war correspondent said at the time of the attack on the convoy he was ordered out of the control room. The next thing he heard was a tremendous explosion of depth charge, which he described as far louder and more terrifying than anything he'd had ever heard on the Western Front, the explosion of Stuka aeroplane bombs included. He staggered out of the control room, where Lemp immediately ordered him over the side. He believed Lemp intended to commit suicide by going down with the U-boat, but the U-boat did not sink. It is possible that he threw himself over the side and deliberately allowed himself to be carried away. U-201 is believed to have carried out her part of the plan of attack as arranged. Empire Cloud, 5,969 tons, and Gregila, 5,802 tons, were torpedoed about 14:38 on the 9th of May 1941, 36 minutes after the U-110 had attacked the convoy. The former ships were, however, not sunk and later towed to port. Here's a diagram then. You can see the Bulldog, the Bertha Broadway hunting U-110 at the top there. ST Apollo picking up the survivors of the Bengal Head. The 2R1 then submerged. The convoy, after the attack of the U-110, turned 40 degrees to port. The 201 fired and managed to strike the Empire Cloud and the Gregula. George Fogden was an engineer mechanic aboard the Bulldog, served with my dad. I just wanted to read a little bit about his story. Just after the encounter with U-110, we were given 2 days break to allow each half of the crew to run ashore, relaxing and having a few pints of beer. In the meantime, another group of merchant ships were arriving in the bay, ready to be escorted to Iceland. When our break was over and all the crew refreshed, we assembled the convoy in the correct order, slower ships at the fore and the fastest at the rear, and then we set sail on the way to Reykjavik. We ran into some stormy weather on the way up, and it was a great relief to see Iceland on the horizon. However, our luck ran out because of the weather. The Canadian Navy had failed to bring up their convoy from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and we had instructions to carry on without a convoy after they was diverted into the harbour. We were to sail to Halifax to collect the convoy, which we were supposed to escort back to Scotland. We sailed to Halifax and expected to be able to call in at Reykjavik on the way back to take in fuel supplies and have a 2-day break, which was the normal routine. We assembled the convoy at Halifax and started our return journey to Iceland. Everything was running smoothly, or so we thought. About halfway between Halifax and Iceland, we received orders to scatter the convoy, as the German battleship Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen were travelling down between Greenland and Iceland with the intention of attacking an Atlantic convoys. They were being chased by ships of the home fleet, including our battleships HMS Hood, the Prince of Wales, and 2 cruisers HMS Norfolk and Suffolk, and the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious. They would later be joined by battleships HMS King George V, Rodney and Repulse. Our instructions were to leave the convoy with a small escort and to steam south in case we needed to help in the battle against the Bismarck later on. We duly sailed south, and eventually we were running desperately short of fuel because we hadn't been able to refuel at Reykjavik. We were by then approaching the Azores, and being a neutral country, we could not enter the harbour without permission. Our captain radioed the British consulate on the Azores and explained our situation and asked if they could help. A response was immediately put into operation. We were allowed to enter the harbour, where to our relief an oil tanker was at anchor. After careful manoeuvring, tying up on the starboard side of the tanker, the next operation was to connect up the fuel pipes to our tanks and start taking on fuel. We also hoped that while we were in harbour, it could be arranged for some stores, food, etc. to be brought out to us. However, after we started taking on fuel, we noticed on the other side of the tanker, also refuelling, was the German U-boat. This caused great consternation, because if the U-boat left harbour before us, it could be waiting when we got out, and it would be an obvious target for their torpedoes. So while we were refuelling, news came through the ship's radio that HMS Bismarck had sunk HMS Hood. This was unbelievable, as the Hood was always considered to be unsinkable. In view of what happened, our captain decided that we could not wait for stores to be brought out to us. So as soon as our fuel tanks were full, we would leave the harbour, wait for new instructions, and do the best with the stores we had on board. On getting out of the harbour, our captain asked for further instructions, and Admiral Tovey, on board HMS King George V and in charge of operations, radioed back and said we would not be required to return north to reassemble with the convoy and carry on as normal. We then spent a couple of days getting back to our convoy and reassembling to start the journey back. In this time, our stores and food were diminishing rapidly, and it was a matter of tightening our belts. The worst thing of all was our bread supply. First the crust went green, which wasn't too bad because we could cut off the crust. Then the inside of the bread started going green. This we covered with jam and pretended it wasn't there. After a while, when the bread was really inedible, we had to go to what's known as the service's hard tack. This was a form of biscuit, like a dog biscuit, and as long as your teeth were good, you had no problem eating them. And you had a cup of tea, you could always dunk them in to soften them up. Besides running out of bread, our meat supply had also been diminished, and we had to go on to another good old standby, tins of corned beef. These were 7 pounds in weight and were issued at 1 tin per mess, about 12 men's rations. We also had tins of sardines, which helped to give us a variety of food and vitamins. Powdered milk and vegetables that included tinned carrots and dried peas needed to be soaked overnight. Fortunately, we were on the homeward journey, so we're looking forward to getting back with some real food. This excerpt from The Ultra Goes to War by Ronald Llewellyn, I think describes very nicely the significance, I think, of this capture of the Enigma. When Bulldog reached Scotland, having sent to the Admiralty a cautionary, non-committal signal about her success, she was joined by Lieutenant Alan Bacon, RNVR, who worked in special liaison between the Naval Section and Bletchley, an operational intelligence centre. On the 25th of June, he would take part in the pinch of Lemberg. Bacon spent many hours examining the captured papers in the captain's cabin of Bulldog. His verdict: this is what they've been looking for. Every page was then photographed, the risk of losing the originals in air transit back to London being too great. And then finally, in the Interact treasure trove, arrived at Bletchley Park. With great speed, cryptanalysis in Hut 8 now penetrated Hydra, which in 1941 the general-purpose cipher used for ships in the North Sea and the Baltic for minesweepers, patrol craft, etc. Off the French coast and Norwegian coast at that time, for all U-boats, at last the sieve was leaking, nor did the benefits of the pinch run out at the end of June. Experience gained during those 2 months of working with known settings enabled Bletchley to continue to read Hydra with occasional gaps until the end of the war, as well as to penetrate in due course the big ship cipher, Neptune. History written in terms of Trafalgar at Jutland, but the standard of seizure of the U-10 should rate as a major victory at sea. Its consequences were instantaneous. To support what intended to be the marauding cruise of Bismarck and her escort Prince Eugen, and to replenish U-boats, a small swarm of tankers and supply ships had been stationed strategically over a vast area of the North Atlantic, down to the divide between West Africa and South America. Ultra derived from Hydra now made their elimination possible. On the 23rd of June, hunting groups of the Royal Navy had sunk all 6 tankers and 1 supply ship assigned to Bismarck, as well as 2 more supply ships intended to sustain armed merchant raiders. Raiders themselves were sunk and harried along with their suppliers, the whole operation being so successful that Admiral Dönitz reached a distasteful conclusion. His Atlantic U-boats could no longer be maintained by surface ships. They would have to rely on underwater supply craft, the Mitchko U-boats. My father joined the RNVR on the 2nd of September 1939, aged 20, and was stationed at shore bases Victory 2 and Victory 3 down here in Portsmouth. On the 9th of October 1940, he joined his first ship, HMS Bulldog, as an ordinary seaman. The ship was assigned for duty with the Clyde Escort Force for patrol and convoy. On the 2nd of November, joined local escort for convoy WS4 with cruiser Cairo, HMS destroyer Beagle, and remained on home fleet duties. After a refit in January 1941, the ship had a work-up exercises until starting convoy duties in the North Atlantic. At that time he lived in Bootle in Liverpool with his newly married wife Prue. Married in 1940, my mum was from the Isle of Man, where life was quite tranquil. She could see the terrible raids across the water from the Isle of Man on Liverpool docks being bombed. She moved to the mainland to work in a munition factory near Liverpool in 1940-41. They lived at number 67 Oriel Road in Bootle. The house was bombed and they moved to Bedford Road. My sister Carol was born in 1941, and then 2 years later my brother Bobby in 1943. He remained in the Royal Navy until 1946. His spell with the Bulldog was quite short, from the 9th of October 1940 to July 1941. From there, he joined HMS Erebus and then combined operations, become a petty officer in 1943 at HMS Dundonald. Then HMS Dinosaur, HMS Odyssey, HMS Attack, HMS Shrapnel, and in November 1944, it was posted to Arromanches, Mulberry Bee, Royal Annex. A funny story I remember in telling me, they were sent to guard a warehouse. This is in December 1944. During the night, they were inside the warehouse. They heard a noise outside, didn't know what it was. It was all deadly quiet. So my father decided that the best thing he could do was fire his gun through the door, hopefully hit whatever was on the other side, thinking it might have been a German or something. Of course, the reality was there was not a German within 50 miles of where he was at the time. But of course, as he opened fire through the door, all the rest of the compound opened fire, all on the watchtowers and everything else. There was a big inquiry the next day asking who fired the first shot. So you can imagine my father was going to be a little bit quiet about that one. But there we are. That's one of the stories that I remember him saying to me all those years ago. This document is about a bill not being paid for an item of clothing. It just seems amazing, really. You're overseas, you're in the middle of the Atlantic somewhere, getting shot at, torpedoed, and God knows what else, and they still want some money out of you. So I think it was quite an interesting letter. But basically he's saying that he owes £5 and 10 shillings, and they've been trying to get in touch with him. I think half the trouble with this one, I think, was they were sending it to his parents' address, and of course he was living in Liverpool at that time, and the letter went to his mum's, I think, at County Durham. So there we are. So always an interesting one, and there's only two things that we're assured of, and that's death and taxes, isn't it? And paying all those bills. Campaign stars, clasps and medals instituted in recognition of service in the war 1939 to 1945. 5 medals and all, as you can see: 1939 to 1945 Star, the Atlantic Star, the Defence Medal, the War Medal, and the France and Germany Medal. The photograph is taken quite late on in the war, I believe in 1944. It's been a real pleasure to make this video. I have learned a lot in the process of research, but above all, I think the incredible sacrifice ordinary and extraordinary men and women made throughout the war. Our merchant navy sailors, without whom our survival surely depended, with those vital supplies from our American friends across the Atlantic and all of our allies. I would like to dedicate this video to my mum, Doris Rose, who brought up my brother and I after my mother died in 1966. My father died in 1983, a modest but proud man, never really spoke much about those dark days of World War II. I was going to do a further video about combined operations and the many bases throughout the UK, some used for training and others where they would test new equipment, for example landing craft and gunnery schools. Thank you so much for joining me on my dad's service. I will leave links to some of the documents below if you would like to look at them in more detail.